Almost everything you've been taught about attraction is wrong. This is probably not a shock to you if you watch my videos regularly, but I'm not exactly the most traditionally masculine guy in the world. I run a psychology podcast, which probably tells you everything you need to know. And this was a big problem for me when I was growing up because it really felt like the Venn diagram between being more masculine and being attractive was just a circle. There was this pretty narrow image of masculinity that was presented to me by movies, magazines, and other guys, and the way to be attractive was by acting like that. I was a sensitive, skinny kid with bad skin who desperately wanted to connect with people, and I felt totally undesirable, in large part because I didn't match that image. And it wasn't just in my head. I was bullied, I was called a lot of names, and it was made really clear to me that the way I was wrong. I was being a man incorrectly, and I spent most of my teen years convinced that no one would ever be interested in me. This led to a lot of anxiety, shame, issues around self-worth, even some body image issues that I carried around for years. And in a way, it was true. My values, what I really cared about, seemed very different from the picture of masculinity that I had internalized. I was warm, I was relational, I was interested in other people. You would never describe me as stoic or aggressive, and that just didn't line up with the image of masculinity that I carried around in my head. Now, the funny part is that it worked out for me. My fiance is a wonderful woman. She is smart and funny and kind. She's also much better looking than I am. And obviously, I hadn't suddenly transformed into some macho stereotype. So looking back, this had really been true all along. I wanted to attract women, and they weren't the people telling me that I needed to be more masculine. By my mid-20s, I was doing just fine. Those messages came to me from the culture generally, and particularly from other men. The narrative that had been sold to me was more masculine equals more attractive, but my real-life experience didn't line up with that at all. When I looked around, I also saw so many men trying to attract women by playing into that image of acceptable masculinity, and women sometimes choosing men because they performed that image well. And it was going terrible for everyone. They were either getting no interest, or they weren't able to connect with the people they actually wanted to attract, or they were landing in these totally dysfunctional relationships. Even so, even after seeing that that image wasn't helping out other guys, and I had just done fine without it, I still carried around this weird shame for feeling essentially like I was too feminine. Now, I am far from alone here. These are very common experiences for people growing up, and in this video, I'm going to try to unpack this whole mess. I'll be talking about why we attached certain traits to how we think of masculinity while removing others, where those ideas came from, and who benefits from all of this. Along the way, we'll try to figure out what really is attractive to most people, and I'll use that to make some suggestions in the back half of the video. This is pretty easily the most personal video I've ever done. It's a long one, and in some ways, it's really just a big letter to my younger self. I hope it helps you out if you've been struggling with some of these issues. The first question we have to ask ourselves here is a simple one. Is being masculine more attractive? Part of the problem we run into when we start talking about masculinity or attractiveness is that the words themselves are contextual and difficult to define. Masculinity means different things to different people. It's meant different things over time, and I really can't show you one picture and go, this is it. A huge part of the problem here is that people have literally started to do that, and it's given us this profoundly one-dimensional perspective. I'm coming to this conversation from my perspective. As a straight man who's attracted to women, I'd imagine that these questions are, if anything, even more complicated and fraught for people who orient differently. But I can only speak to my own experience. And because I'm attracted to women, I value their opinion. The most basic sales logic here would tell you that if you want to sell a product, in this case, yourself, to a group of people, you go to that group, you do some research, you figure out what they're into, and then you go from there. Maybe you get some feedback, you iterate on it, and you come back with a strong second version. But that's not what's happening here. It's telling that the part of the self-help world that's aimed at young men who feel undesirable and unattractive, red pill stuff, pickup artist culture, all of that, is dominated by men telling men what women want. They rarely ask women, and even when they do, they don't seem to believe the answers. So they have to rely on what they've got, which is what they think women seem to be attracted to. This is why their answers to the question of what does a desirable man look like are usually stereotypical, oversimplified, and almost mythological. Comic book heroes and villains, characters from film and TV idealizing the Roman Empire, that kind of thing. They're essentially engaging in projection. Rather than finding what women are attracted to, they've found what they're attracted to. These are echo chambers that have created an image of male attractiveness built for the straight male gaze. There's a reason there's a whole family of memes based on men going to the gym because they want to attract more women, but they usually just end up getting complimented by other men. Looking good, king. This approach would be a disaster under the best circumstances, but it doesn't help that the people giving this advice on how to be successful with women seem to mostly be single men who have, at best, a pretty mixed track record with women they weren't actively trafficking. And I want to be clear here. As somebody who felt profoundly unattractive for most of my life, I really feel for people. This stuff is so deeply connected to our self-worth and self-identity, so attraction feels both incredibly high stakes and incredibly random. You can do everything there is to do, and the person you like might not like you back. There's this line I love: the fastest way to drive someone insane is to hold them responsible for results they can't control. That's what dating feels like to most people. So it makes sense that we would want to crack the code and find that simple, one-size-fits-all solution here. And the people preying on those young men love to act like they've got all the answers. But obviously, that's just not how this works. What we think of as attractive, particularly what we think of as physically attractive, is a total moving target. It's individual, it's contextual, it's changed dramatically over time, and any attempt to generalize, including some of the ones that I'm going to be doing later, is going to be full of holes. Any image we create of what an attractive person acts like or looks like is going to appeal to, at best, a slice of the distribution. And yes, there are absolutely some physical traits that tend to attract more people than others. If you're a straight guy, being tall and fit is probably going to help you out. But we're often completely off base about the physical traits that we assume are attractive to people. For example, there was a recent study that found that men with more feminine traits tend to be more desirable to women long-term, without sacrificing much in the way of short-term desirability. There are also plenty of studies that have found things like women tend to prefer male faces that have what we think of as traditionally feminine shapes and include features like big eyes or small chins, possibly because they signal stereotypically feminine personality traits, such as warmth, honesty, and nurturance, while very masculine facial features are typically perceived as cold, dishonest, and uncooperative. It's really important to emphasize here that regardless of the size and shape of your body, how masculine or feminine you present, whatever, there are people out there who are into exactly that. The way you are isn't just something they're willing to roll with because you've got these other good traits. No, that's actually their thing. My partner has a serious boner for Steve Buscemi, for God's sake, which maybe helps explain how I managed to pull that one off. Bottom line, people are complicated. For most, it's going to be difficult to jam all of who they are into this single box of feminine or masculine. They've got some traits we think of as conventionally masculine and others we think of as more feminine. I'm really into football. This is particularly true when you get off the internet and you look around in the real world. In real life, people who try to reduce everything to that single label and really embody a kind of like hyper feminine or hyper masculine archetype come across, frankly, as kind of weird. This then takes us to a really important question. What do we even mean by masculine and feminine? What are the traits that we're attaching to each of those words? And why are we putting them in one bucket and not the other? Whenever somebody references a study, I'd recommend getting in the habit of looking at what it actually said, because it's really easy to jump to conclusions after just reading a headline or even a few sentences from an abstract, like say, from this study published earlier this year, which found that women rated feminine male profiles as more romantically appealing than masculine ones, but less so than profiles possessing a combination of feminine and masculine traits. That doesn't sound great for trad masculinity off the top, but I took a look at how that particular study defined feminine and masculine. What they did is they asked men to agree or disagree with statements like, I see myself as sympathetic and warm. I see myself as affectionate. I enjoy interacting and playing with children, as well as asking them questions about how many sexual partners they'd had and whether they thought of their behavior as more traditionally masculine or feminine. If the guy rated themselves as affectionate, Sympathetic, warm, tolerative kids, those were more feminine traits. They then created fake dating profiles for these men and asked women to rate them on attractiveness and decide whether or not they would be interested in going on a date with them. Generally speaking, the more feminine profiles did better. But we have to pause for a second here, because I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. Is being emotionally warm inherently feminine? Why is that a feminine trait and not a masculine one? How about being affectionate or empathic? These traits are clearly tied to how we have set femininity up in the culture, but it just takes a moment of observation to see that these aren't fem traits or masc traits. They're human traits. They exist in a distribution across all people, and removing them from how we think of masculinity really does men dirty. Being emotionally intelligent requires a basic capacity for empathy, and it's one of the most useful real-world skills out there. Being an asshole to customer service people doesn't make you a better man, it just makes you an asshole. If you want to be a dad, it's an obvious positive to enjoy interacting with kids, and producing the maximum number of offspring is something those red pill types talk about all the time. If traits like being warm, affectionate, or emotionally intelligent are both useful on their own and highly attractive to women, why don't we tend to associate them with the idealized image of masculinity that we carry around in our heads? Why are we bombarding young men with the message be masculine to be attractive, when a lot of those supposedly masculine traits are pretty shitty when it comes to either attracting a partner or maintaining a functional, high-quality relationship? Again, what's going on here? To start with a disclaimer, I'm not a sociologist, and some of the details when it comes to this stuff are clearly outside of my area of expertise, but I'll do my best. There are a set of common ideas that Western society is marinated in about what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. Idealized men are strong and courageous. They're physically dominant, have a deep voice, and value intellect over emotionality. Emotional vulnerability isn't just avoided, it doesn't really exist, because the ideal man has achieved total mastery over those emotions. This model is what's called a hegemonic ideal. This is a set of values and standards that are widely accepted and perpetuated within a cultural or social group. These ideals, this idea of what it means to be a man, are so dominant and they are so pervasive that they seem obvious to us. It's just common sense that guys are or should be this way. It might even seem like a kind of natural law. This view of masculinity is not an accident, and it does not exist in a vacuum. It connects to much bigger topics related to how dominant groups of people preserve their power. Hegemonic masculinity is a term coined by the Australian sociologist Raewyn Connell to describe the pattern of practice, things done not just to set of role expectations, that allowed men's dominance over women to continue. Hegemonic masculinity embodied the currently most honored way of being a man, required all other men to position themselves in relation to it, and ideologically legitimated the global subordination of women to men. The red pill alt-right groups I've mentioned during this video are collectively referred to as the Manosphere. This is a vast and somewhat difficult to define collection of typically very conservative individuals and organizations promoting men's rights alongside a wide variety of overtly misogynistic views. The general basis of their argument is that society is falling apart because we've strayed away from that traditional vision of hegemonic masculinity. In an article for the Washington Post about the Santa Barbara shooter back in 2014, journalist Caitlin Dewey wrote that the core philosophies behind the Manosphere are: feminism has corrupted modern culture in violation of biological, my emphasis added, gender differences, and men can best seduce women and save society in general by embracing a super dominant, uber masculine gender role. Inside of these spaces, the power structure is pretty obvious. You've got more masculine at the top, more feminine at the bottom. Being more masculine means more practical benefits, more friends, more money, more success with women. But there's a moral aspect to the whole thing as well. Pursuing this vision isn't just good for you as an individual, it's good for society as a whole because it puts men back into their natural position at the top of the hierarchy while women fall in line behind them. And setting aside the dollar store philosophizing here, the bottom line is that these spaces are very concerned with how to get women. It's not a coincidence that a lot of this emerged out of pickup artist culture, but it's important to not fixate on those extreme red pill spaces. It's easy to do that because the bullshit peddled by these people is so over the top, but it can lull us into feeling like this is just a fringe ideology. People who think and talk this way are all over the place. There is a huge pipeline into these ideas for young men. It's actually very difficult to consume the content or hang out in the spaces that they frequent without being exposed to them. The concept of more masculine equals more dominant equals more attractive is pervasive. That's the whole point of a hegemonic idea. You don't have to search for it. So you've got this group of guys telling young, impressionable men that they have to look a certain way and act a certain way in order to attract women. Making young men feel bad about themselves and then profiting off their low self-esteem is big business for these people. And there's no shortage of shady seminars, online products, and other assorted bullshit. They are creating insecurity and then preying on it. To make the obvious point here, these guys do not have your best interests at heart. I want to take a detour into a common rebuttal to some of the things I've talked about so far. A fair question to ask about the studies I've referred to, and about a lot of research on psychology in general, is how closely people's actual behavior matches up with the preferences that they might state in something like a study. After all, we've all had that friend who says they're into this kind of person when they consistently end up with that kind of person. So clearly there's some gap between what people say they care about and what they actually end up doing. In research, this is known as the intention-behavior gap. This gap is often used online as an argument by men who haven't been very successful with women. After all, I'm a nice guy, and women say they like nice guys, but women don't seem to like me, so they must be lying about what they care about. What women actually like are these traditional, hegemonic markers of masculinity, and if I embody those traits more, women will like me. Now, there is a ton of research on this gap, including research specifically focused on dating and partner selection. For example, one study from 2008 used speed dating as an attempt to differentiate between stated preferences and people's actual behavior. Before the dates, the participants were interviewed about their preferences, and they exhibited traditional sex differences when stating them. This meant that the male participants tended to value physical attractiveness more than the female participants, and the female participants tended to value earning prospects more than the male participants. Pretty gendered. As an aside, it's hard to find a more hegemonic value when it comes to attractiveness than valuing male earning potential. And historically, the gap between male and female earning has been a major source of the power men have over women. It's helpful to remember that it wasn't until the 70s that women were even allowed to apply for a credit card without a man signing off on it. Women are taught that it's dudes who make the money, and guess what? You need money to live, so find you a dude who makes a lot of money. You can tie a lot of the rage and panic in red pill communities directly to the tightening of the gender pay gap over the last 50 years or so. Education is a good predictor of income, and there are now more women than men with an undergraduate degree. Men can no longer rely on assuming that they'll just make more money than women, and will therefore end up with somebody almost by default. Because we've established money as a critical thing to have, and it is clearly attractive, I'm not trying to argue that it's not, but it's fair to ask how big a deal it is in normal range, real-life situations. In real life, Todd the billionaire is not airdropping in to steal your girl, and this is reflected in studies like the one I referenced from 2008. It turned out that participants' ideal preferences, assessed before the speed dating event, failed to predict what inspired their actual desire at the event. We'd probably guess that there was a lot of virtue signaling in the participants' expressed preferences, and then they just ended up going for the hot, wealthy person, right? But it turned out that it was actually the other way around. As I said, women expressed a preference for a high-earning man, and men expressed a preference for an attractive woman. But their actual choices at the event itself were more influenced by overall compatibility and interaction quality. Put simply, by whether or not they got along. Okay, so let's recap for a second here. The conventional image of male attractiveness is mostly made by men for men. There's a lot of research that suggests that, at the very least, attraction is not as simple as just be more masculine, and we can look out into the world and see all of these examples of people doing just fine for themselves without carrying typical markers of masculinity. We've also removed all of these traits that are linked to both short-term and long-term relationship success from the associations we have with masculinity, while loading it with a variety of traits that are actively unattractive to most women. So this is the part of the video where I talk about some of the things that actually matter, that will make you more attractive and lead to more success in your relationships. There is so much that we could talk about here, so I cut it down to about 7, because this video is already very long. I focused on things that people either don't talk about enough or tend to misunderstand. If you made it 30 minutes into this video, you probably don't need me to tell you that showering regularly is a good idea. Before we get into it, I want to give you an important disclaimer. As I've said a few times now, attraction is obviously a profoundly individual thing. What this means is that if I want to be accurate, if I want to create something that's actually useful for you, person watching this video, I need to really consider individual variation, and I need to avoid overgeneralizing based on your group membership. In any given group, men, women, different cultural groups, whatever, there's going to be just a massive range of traits that might be considered attractive. And because the person-to-person differences are so great here, any advice I give needs to be really broad if it's going to be useful. And the punchline here is that by the time my advice is general enough to cover a good chunk of that intra-group variation, the differences between different men, it's no longer specific to being an attractive man. It's just about being an attractive person. And that's a good mindset to approach this whole topic with, particularly if you feel like you've struggled to connect with people in the past. So let's get into it. First, focus on what you can control and be smart about who you want to attract. This is a criminally under-discussed part of relationships. People often experience enormous anxiety about attracting a partner because they're focusing on these superficial physical traits that they have little control over. Are you 6 feet tall? Are you relatively fit? How does your voice sound? The brutal reality is that most of the physical traits that we've highlighted in that hegemonic image of masculinity are just not very changeable for people. Even factors like how much you earn are heavily influenced by where you live and who your parents are. And because the culture seems to place such a high value on those traits, it's normal to experience a lot of anxiety if you feel like you don't have them. This creates a couple of major issues for people. First, focusing on these things has a ton of costs for you. Stress, body image issues, mental health problems, all kinds of stuff. Second, the sense that a person feels anxious and insecure about themselves is itself kind of unattractive, and people know that. So feeling anxious and insecure usually just leads to us feeling even more anxious and insecure. We get out of this by focusing on what we can control, which is a cheat code for everything from relationships to mental health to overall success in life. We can't control what somebody else thinks or feels. We can only control our own behavior. And one way to regain that sense of agency, the feeling that we're more like a hammer and less like a nail, is by turning the issue around and asking yourself a really simple question. Do you want to care about attracting somebody who's focused on those superficial qualities? Most people would be immensely served. I would have been immensely served by pausing for a second, taking a step back, and asking, do I want to care about attracting someone who needs their partner to be 6 feet tall? We need to locate the problem accurately here. The problem is not you, 5'7" dude. The problem is that we've taught people to fixate on meaningless traits that have nothing to do with good relationship outcomes. And we can expand this idea out to give ourselves just a much clearer vision of what we're really trying to accomplish here. Write down some of the traits that the person that you're trying to attract has. What are they like? What do they value? What does being around them feel like? Do you want to be with somebody who is incapable of getting off their phone, or who gossips frequently about other people? Or how about somebody who is hyper-focused on what others think about them, or who regularly compares you negatively to others? Do you want to attract the kind of person who idealizes those classic masculine archetypes that I've mentioned? What would a relationship with that person look and feel like on a day-to-day basis? Not in a fantasy, in real life. Somebody who is not just a fun time, but an actually good partner for you is probably not going to care about those superficial qualities so much. And that can then help us lighten up a little bit and be a little bit less anxious and self-critical about the things we just can't do that much about. This then in turn makes us more confident, comfortable, and hey, more attractive. Second, learn what charisma really is. Charisma is one of the most useful things we can develop because it affects all of our social outcomes. Work life, romantic life, friendships, the rooms we can walk into, it is all affected by charisma. And this is one of the reasons that a huge amount of the content that's produced in the Manosphere focuses on becoming more charismatic. But the people who make that content often seem to completely misunderstand what charisma really is. There is a ton of research, thankfully, on charisma that can guide us here. And it turns out that it isn't based on extroversion or intelligence or even physical attractiveness, which, it turns out, is just a small piece of the puzzle. Charisma isn't about either having that witty one-liner ready to go or seeming kind of aloof and disinterested in other people. Those things can maybe cover for a lack of charisma under the right circumstances, but what charismatic people do differently is they constantly signal two key characteristics. The first is competence, which you probably could have guessed. Charismatic people seem capable and reliable. They're the kind of people who can get the job done. They appear successful, sure, but it's not just that. They're also the kind of person you'd enjoy having on your team. And a big piece of this is the second key characteristic in charisma, warmth, which includes friendliness, likability, and trustworthiness. The great thing about charisma is that it's learned, it's not an innate trait, and most people really can become warmer and more competent over time. But many make the mistake of putting too much emphasis on one of those traits over the other. Remember what we were talking about earlier. Warmth is often thought of as an unmasculine trait, which sets men up to fail because it's also a key aspect of charisma. This means that men tend to prioritize competence and start to forget about warmth. So what's a great way to signal more warmth? The third thing we're going to talk about, listening. If you want to be interesting, be interested. This comes from Dale Carnegie in the classic book, How to Make Friends and Influence People, and it's just as true now as it was when he wrote it then. If you watch many social interactions with people, it's pretty clear that most people aren't really listening, they're just waiting for their opportunity to talk. The closest most people get to really express an interest in a conversation is saying something like, oh yeah, and that reminds me of the time when, and then they launch into some story about themselves. This is, again, particularly true of men, who are taught to privilege competence over warmth, and they tend to make the mistake of thinking that a great way to demonstrate competence is by talking about themselves a lot. Getting comfortable with listening alone will do wonders for you socially, but it also unlocks maybe the most important relationship building skill there is, asking questions. When you really start paying attention to what other people are saying, you can suddenly ask much better questions. And good questions are one of the best ways to demonstrate both competence and warmth. If you want to speed run intimacy in a relationship, ask more and more meaningful questions. Questions that are interesting without being inappropriate, and that show that you've been really paying attention. Fourth, invest in yourself, develop authentic interests, and stand for something. I'm lumping a lot together here. This is a huge category, but it's how you get to real competence. This isn't just about appearing attractive, it's about becoming somebody that you're proud to be, which usually has the, hello, wonderful side effect of making you more attractive. People want to be with someone who is going somewhere. It's hard to create a map when you don't know what the destination is, and in this case, that means identifying key values, what you truly care about, what's really meaningful to you. Once you figure that out, you can work backwards to identify some important goals that would help you along the way. All of a sudden, you have a sense of purpose, the feeling that you're going after something in your life. When you pursue things from that base, because you genuinely care about them or enjoy them, not because you have some weird ulterior motives here, everything changes. Authentic interests make you more interesting and give other people the sense that you have some depth. They provide topics for conversation, opportunities for shared experiences, and you can even get some new social connections out of them. This beautiful thing happens when how you act lines up more and more with what you care about. As that gap closes, we make more choices aligned with our values. We have a sense of direction. We become more consistent. This then gives us more confidence and starts to build self-respect. This feels great. We get happier. That makes us more fun to be around. Other people start to respect us more. We get better at establishing some healthy boundaries with the people who don't respect us so much, or who aren't putting that work in. It's this huge upward spiral. If you really do this, it will completely change your life. Fifth, look for people who are excited to have you. If you do the previous step and start investing in yourself, this will really happen naturally, but it also felt important to mention it on its own. There are going to be times in every person's life where they want to be part of a social group, or when they're interested in a person romantically, and that person or that group just doesn't want them back. This happens to everyone, and it is totally normal. Not accepting that rejection hurts everyone involved. It's the root of some of the most destructive, abusive behavior out there, and it also hurts you, because it means that you're not really valuing your time and your energy. These are limited, important resources. Invest them where they are genuinely appreciated by other people. So many people waste their times trying to, choose your metaphor here, get blood from a stone, push that same boulder uphill, fish in a parking lot, when if they just relaxed, lightened up, and turned around, they would see there is an ocean full of fish behind them. In order to be willing to take no for an answer, we need to develop a basic level of emotional regulation. This is a key skill in general, and it's also what allows us the freedom to shrug, move on, and retain our self-worth without making it weird. Yes, there are some people out there who want you to prove you're interested in them by continuing to pursue them even when they've blown you off. Do not play those games. This gets back to the who are you trying to attract question. If you reach out to a person a few times and they're not interested, move on. Trust me, you do not need the kind of drama that person is going to bring into your life. Bottom line, nothing is less attractive than desperation. Sixth, and this could miff some people, pass the bear test. Safety is arguably our most fundamental need, and we're not just talking about physical safety here. The reality is that you can look like a linebacker or a fitness model and make somebody feel incredibly uncomfortable. Physical dominance can provide a person with safety, yes, but it can take it away just as easily. And physical safety is just one aspect of safety. The importance of psychological and emotional safety has been a major focus of research over the last few decades, and it's a key aspect of every single healthy relationship. This also relates to another huge mistake that people make about charisma. Many people seem to think that appearing dangerous makes somebody more charismatic. Guys often feel this way because they feel like they're seeing women go for that bad boy archetype, but they're usually misunderstanding what's really going on here. First, a lot of the time that's just not what's really happening. Again, there is so much weird, often right-wing, almost voyeuristic content out there that tries to convince young men that if they're not alpha enough, Todd will come in and steal their girl. Is that really happening, or is it mostly just fear-mongering on TikTok? Second, there is a huge gap between a fantasy and reality. Remember those surveys from earlier. What people say they're into and what they actually respond positively to are often fairly different. People can get hot and bothered for the characters from their favorite romantasy book, in part because they are safely confined to the page. No sane person actually wants to be in a relationship with the Joker or whatever, and, if you do, you should probably get that looked at. Third, if it is really happening, if this person really is pursuing somebody who is truly dangerous, then there's a good chance that they're just not making good choices. They're opening themselves up to a lot of potential harm. And some guys try to manipulate this and attract the type of woman who's interested in that by appearing to be that type of guy. This then leads to some incredibly dysfunctional situations that often include abuse. They're totally unhealthy and they flame out. You don't want to be that guy long term. Healthy people do not want to be around people who are dangerous to them. They want to be around somebody who can help protect them from other dangerous people. There's no better example of healthy masculinity out there than being a safe harbor for the people you care about. Again, it is so important here to focus on the psychological and emotional aspect of this because it's the part that we often miss. People want to feel like they can be themselves around you without living in fear of being attacked or criticized for who they are. One of the biggest mistakes that I made when I was younger was being hypercritical and then excusing it by saying things like, oh, I just have these high standards, or, oh, I know that there's this really right way to do it, and why don't people just do it the right way? Maybe. But if you're being unpleasant, nobody cares. More generally, passing the bear test isn't really about being less dangerous than the bear. It's about having the social and the emotional intelligence to understand the general point that's being made here. Your experience is not, in fact, the only experience. What feels safe to you might not feel safe to another person, and feeling safe is one of the most important psychological needs we have. Seventh, get comfortable with your body. This is a pretty complicated one, so I'm just going to focus on my own experience, and maybe you can relate to it. Men are often encouraged to prioritize logic, reason, and intellect. This was very true for me, and when I was younger, I was mostly given positive feedback based on my ability to think about things, which included doing well in school, that kind of thing. I was rewarded for it, so I did more of it. And alongside the rewards I got for being this big thinker, I was carrying around all of this shame that I talked about in the introduction about my body. It just made sense for me to distance myself from that, to distance myself from my body. But this also meant distancing myself from how my emotions felt. I became an incredible cognitive bypasser. Because I didn't let those feelings out, they just built up inside of me. Much like how men tend to over-index on competence and under-index on warmth, my guess is that the kind of people who get to this part of the video probably over-index on being big thinkers and under-index on healthy embodiment, just like I did. One of the best choices I ever made was starting dancing as a hobby when I was 18. It's still a major hobby of mine, it's been hugely rewarding for its own sake, and building that kind of physical relationship with my body made me so much more comfortable with myself. Taking on that regular physical practice eventually led to a pretty dramatic change in how I thought about myself. Rather than constantly criticizing myself for how I was, I started getting a feeling of accomplishment based on what I could do. I started appreciating aspects of myself that had to, until that point, just been sources of stress, and it also really helped me with some emotional processing. I just felt much happier and more complete, a whole person rather than a brain that was walking around in a skin suit. And this is before we even get into all of the value that I got out of it socially. In general, I think that people tend to experience catharsis, and this is an emotional breakthrough that they need to finally process an emotion or something and move forward in life, when they're able to embrace the parts of their experience that they've pushed away. Top-down people, like me, reach that cathartic moment when they finally connect with the body and let go of some of its pent-up feelings. More bottom-up people, maybe more like my fiancée Elizabeth, often achieve catharsis when they're finally able to understand, communicate, and apply a degree of top-down control to how they feel. Both sides of the coin, working together. As we get to the end of the video, I want to emphasize something that I feel like I haven't said enough, and I've said a lot of words during this video. This isn't about being less masculine or more masculine. There are plenty of hyper-masculine people out there who are very, very attractive. It's about really considering what the traits are that we're attaching to masculinity, why we're putting those traits there, and what kind of assumptions are we making about what a person might be into. Particularly, if you're somebody who experiences a lot of stress, shame, issues with self-worth because you feel like you are not masculine enough, I just really want to reassure you that the narrative that you're carrying around about attraction broadly is probably just not true. There are plenty of people who are doing fantastically, again, by being the macho stereotype. There are also plenty of people who are doing fantastically for themselves by being anything but. A lot of this comes down to authenticity, self-confidence, communication skills, good relational skills, all of this other stuff that unfortunately we've kind of purged from that traditional vision of what a man looks like or what a man does. And again, I just think that that's a shame. For starters, because it's really ruining some people's relationships, and also it's causing men out there broadly to have a really tough time, particularly if they don't have good role models for them in their personal life about what a, incrementally healthier version of masculinity might look like for them. I hope you got something out of this video. It was a really interesting one for me to put together. It was very personal. I shared some material in it that I don't normally talk about in these videos. If you enjoyed this, you'd probably also like my podcast, Being Well. That's on the channel every week. It's always on Monday. You can check it out if you haven't done that already. I talk to a bunch of experts about psychology and mental health. And if you made it this far, I would really appreciate it if you took a moment to like the video, to subscribe to the channel, and to maybe even leave a comment down below. You can ask me a question about the video, you can share your own experience, anything you want to talk about. It really helps us out in the old algorithm. Thanks for listening today, and I'll talk to you soon.